Hello, everyone. My name is Jaime López, and I am a professor at the Complutense University of Madrid in Spain. Thank you for being here. Today, I would like to talk about contemporary Indian cinema through a topic that is both narrative and cultural, but also connected to broader social questions. The title of my talk is Born at the Climax: Child, Childbirth as Narrative Regeneration in Contemporary Indian Cinema. My focus is on childbirth, and more specifically on childbirth narrative regeneration. In other words, I am interested in how birth can operate not only as a biological event, but as a structural turning point, a symbol of continuity, and a device of closure and renewal at moments of maximum intensity, that is, climactic scenes. I will proceed in four steps. First, I will briefly connect motherhood to a global development framework, focusing on goals that relate to health, care, and inequality. Second, I will outline demographic trends in India, focusing on fertility and births per woman and on the rural urban difference. Third, I will introduce a broader film question about how childbirth tends to appear or not appear in mainstream cinema, especially in Hollywood. Then, in the central part of the talk, I will analyze three recent examples in Indian cinema in which childbirth or the decision not to abort is placed inside climactic moments. I will close with a comparative summary of similarities and differences, and with a broader conclusion about what these patterns suggest. So let me begin with the development framework. Um, let's see, motherhood and the sustainable development goals. Um, Within the Sustainable Developmental Goals, motherhood appears both explicitly and implicitly. That matters because it allows us to treat motherhood not as a private detail, but as a cross cutting dimension of social sustainability. In many contexts, motherhood is where health policy, labor policy, education, family structure, and social inequality intersect. It is a point where public institutions and intimate life meet. Two goals address motherhood directly. Goal 3, good health and well being, includes pregnancy, childbirth, and postpartum health through targets that deal with maternal mortality and with access to sexual and reproductive health services. These targets effectively place pregnancy and childbirth at the center of public health. The event of birth is not simply an individual experience. It becomes something that requires infrastructure, medical access, continuity of care, and social protection. And also, goal 5, gender equality, that it connects motherhood to reproductive rights and to the distribution of care work. It addresses autonomy and rights in reproductive decisions, and it also highlights the reality that care responsibilities are often unevenly distributed. Here, motherhood becomes inseparable from questions of time, labor recognition, and social value. It becomes inseparable from the question of who bears the cost of reproduction, and not only biologically, but also socially. At the same time, several other goals integrate motherhood indirectly, but still in structurally important ways. Goal 1, no poverty, invites us to consider the economic vulnerability of households where care responsibilities concentrate especially where income is unstable or social protection is limited. Childbearing can amplify economic stress, and in some contexts, it can reshape life trajectories in durable ways. Goal 5, decent work and economic growth, is relevant because it makes visible the penalties associated with motherhood in labor markets and also the tendency to treat care work as invisible or non-productive. It opens a pathway for discussing how paid employment, unpaid labor, and social reproduction interact. Goal 10, Reduced Inequalities, highlights how motherhood intersects with class, geography, and social stratification. The experience of motherhood and the ability to make reproductive choices can differ dramatically across regions, income levels, and educational backgrounds. Then we have goal 2 on hunger and nutrition, and it matters because it brings in maternal and child nutrition, which often becomes a decisive factor for health outcomes. Finally, goals 11 and 16 on sustainable communities and on strong institutions allow us to connect motherhood to community cohesion and to contexts shaped by rurality, violence, or weak institutional support. In places where institutions are fragile, the burden of care often returns to families and communities, and motherhood becomes part of the basic fabric through which communities survive and reproduce themselves. So, this framework helps us to see motherhood as a social axis. It also provides a bridge to cinema because film narratives do not only represent private experiences, they often encode wider cultural and social concerns, especially when an event like childbirth is placed at the center of narrative intensity. With this framework in place, I will now turn to fertility trends in India. Births per woman in India. If we look at the total fertility rate, that is, births per woman, and we compare India with several countries, a clear picture emerges. In the comparison I am using, India is set alongside the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, Japan, Spain, and China. In this group, India shows the highest level at around 1.9 to 2 births per woman. The United States follows as 1.62, then the United Kingdom is 1.44, Germany at 1.38, Japan at 1.2, Spain at 1.16, and China at 1.02. The key point is that all of these countries, including India, are below the standard replacement level, usually estimated at around 2.1 births per woman. So even though India is still higher than these comparator countries, it has joined the broader global pattern of fertility decline. If we look at if we look historically, India's fertility decline is striking, and it can be described through a few milestones. In the 1970s, women in India had uh, about 5 children per woman. By the 1990s, the level had fallen to around 3.5. 20 years ago, 2005, 2006, it was approximately 2.7 children per woman and still above replacement. And in the third decade of the 21st century, fertility is now around 1.9 to 2, close to replacement but already below it. These milestones matter for two reasons. First, they show that the current situation is not an isolated fluctuation, it's part of a long-term transition. Second, they establish demographic background against which cultural narratives and film narratives operate. When societies go through demographic transitions, narratives often respond. They often amplify certain themes, anxieties, hopes, and symbolic structures. At the same time, it is essential to distinguish between rural and urban India. Nationally, the figure is around 1.9, but rural fertility is closer to replacement at about 2.1, while urban fertility is lower, around 1.5 children per woman. This rural-urban difference is crucial because it suggests that fertility is not only a national statistic, it is embedded in context, in social norms, and in constraints. So, one question is, why does rural fertility remain higher? Several factors tend to coincide. Marriage often happens earlier in rural areas, and the first child is also born earlier. Contraception is used, but often less effectively than in urban environments. Children can carry a stronger economic value for household survival. Women's participation in paid work tends to be lower than in urban contexts, and pro-natalist norms can remain influential in local communities and family networks. Urban contexts, by contrast, introduce constraints that reduce fertility. Family formation comes later, housing is more expensive, time is more constrained, career pressures and work instability can shape decisions, and the structure of support networks can change when people move away from extended family. If we look in this slide at major Indian cities, a similar pattern becomes visible. Among the cities in the table I am using, Mumbai stands out as having the lowest total fertility rate, around 1.1 to 1.3 births per woman. It is followed by other major cities such as Delhi, Kolkata, Bangalore, Chennai, and Hyderabad. The table also suggests a regional nuance. Cities in southern India are below replacement, but the figures can be slightly higher than those of cities in northern India. The main point here is not to produce a striking ranking, but to show that fertility is shaped by multiple urban contexts, not by one single urban pattern. Nevertheless, in the northern states, fertility is usually higher than in southern states taken as a whole. Mumbai offers a useful example of why fertility can fall so low. First, there is extreme density and high housing costs. Second, people marry later and postpone the first child. Third, women's access to education and paid employment is higher. Fourth, work-life pressures are intense and often precarious. Fifth, support networks for childcare can be weaker in cities like Mumbai because families live far from close relatives. And overall, raising a child costs more in Mumbai than in rural areas. One important clarification is that low fertility in Mumbai is not restricted to elites. Even low income groups show reduced fertility. This suggests that low fertility can be a citywide structural condition rather than merely merely a lifestyle choice associated with the upper middle class. Let me add a brief section on preferences and reproductive norms. Fertility in India is now around 1.9, and the long-term decline from the 1970s is clear. The first rural-urban difference remains significant, with rural fertility higher than urban fertility. Survey research suggests that the two-child family has become a widely shared ideal. At the same time, only about a quarter of married women report that they want another child, meaning a third child. Early marriage and early motherhood remain more common in rural areas. In some regions, there is still a preference for sons, although this appears to be gradually weakening. If we consider abortion, it is legal in India under the Medical Termination of Pregnancy Framework Act. Common reasons include unwanted pregnancy, birth spacing, economic difficulty, and maternal health. Sex-selective abortion is illegal, although historically it has occurred and has affected demographic patterns. Overall, the trend is a decline in fertility shaped by both structural conditions and cultural differences between rural and urban settings. With this demographic background, I will now move to cinema. Before discussing film representations, it is worth noting that myth and storytelling play a strong role in Indian cultural life. Mythological families provide widely shared reference points. Commonly invoked model is Shiva and Parvati with their two sons, Ganesha and Kartikeya, the god of war. Commonly invoked uh, beyond these divine family images, the major epics, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, place family conflict at the center of narrative movement. These stories give family a structural role. Family is not only a theme, family becomes an engine of plot. From there, we can ask a film question. How does cinema represent childbirth? When and where does birth appear? Does it appear as background, as domestic detail, as medical routine, or does it appear as a decisive turning point? In scholarship on Hollywood cinema, one influential line of argument is that childbirth is often handled through ellipses. The event is displaced, avoided, or not only indirectly suggested. Classic example is Stagecoach by John Ford. Men, like in the frame in the left side, men wait outside and the birth is indicated rather than shown directly. Then the attention shifts to the corridor to waiting, anticipation. The viewer is positioned with those who are outside the birthing space. Over time, this pattern can change. Some films move toward darker or disturbing versions of childbirth, including horror inflected imagery, where birth becomes associated with anxiety, monstrosity, or threat, like in Rosemary's Baby or The Fly, for example, by David Cronenberg. Another important point in this discussion is sound. Childbirth involves vocalization that can disrupt ordinary speech. Screams and moans can interrupt dialogue and can affect the sense of controlled narrative language. This may be one reason that childbirth is treated cautiously in mainstream cinema. It introduces something that resists conventional narrative order, as Robin Blatz points out. Later, argument based on interviews and film industry of observations uh, collected by Steve Knopper, contributor to the Wall Street Journal. A later argument, we said, is that explicit childbirth remains one of the last major taboos in mainstream Hollywood cinema. The claim here is that directors and producers assume audiences that do not want to see the baby emerging. Films therefore tend to show the mother in labor, the doctor's hands, the feet of the mother, and then the newborn already delivered. The event is reduced to fragments, and the central bodily moment remains off screen. This line of argument often adds a claim of double standards, according to Nopper. Mainstream cinema may show explicit violence and sex, yet still avoids explicit childbirth. Whether one agrees fully or not, the argument is useful as a contrast point because it highlights that childbirth has a complex status in cinematic representation. Against that background, I will now examine three recent Indian cases in which childbirth or the decision surrounding pregnancy becomes integrated into climactic scenes. Before turning on the films, I want to clarify what I mean by climactic scene. I'm not limiting the term to the single final climax of the main plot. Instead, I use it more broadly as a moment when dramatic tension reaches a peak, the turning point occurs in an important conflict, and the moment becomes decisive for the story. Such scenes typically involve high stakes, confrontation, decisive action, and strong emotional engagement. They can occur near the end, but they can also appear earlier. Structurally, they organize peaks of intensity and help move the narrative toward transformation. With that definition, let me move to the first case. The first case is Tamudu, a Telugu film. Uh, the title means younger brother. The director is Venu Sriram, and it was released in 2025. Here, family is presented as a foundational value from the beginning. The story also opens with systematic murders of families committed by a villain. Childbirth and the newborn then enter the narrative through three climactic sequences, followed by resolution. The protagonist, Jay, is an archery champion with Olympic ambitions. At the same time, he carries an unresolved family conflict. His older sister, who once acted like a mother figure, has cut ties with him for years because of a painful past event. A friend encourages him to find her, wherever she may be. So, from early on, the film frames family as both aspiration and rupture, as both ideal and wound. In parallel, the film introduces a villain which an extreme sensitivity to sounds above a low threshold, like 20, 30 decibels, drive him into crisis. And finally, they might kill him. I mention this detail on sound because it resonates with the broader discussion about sound and childbirth pointed out by Blights. Here, sound is not only emotions, sound becomes vulnerability, danger, and threat. The villain kills families to profit from insurance policies. Jay's sister, now a civil servant, is the one person who could stop him, so the villain orders her death. Jay's sister is attending religious rituals with other family members in a forest or jungle area portrayed as outside the law, lawless, involving tribal groups, and Jay arrives and becomes caught inside this conflict without revealing his identity. The setting, one woman of this family group is about to give birth. So, well, here we see that in the very beginning of the movie, there is a signpost both about people insurance company with the representation of family. Then we see how the villain kills a lot of people. Here we see a woman with her child, and then the woman walking with many corpses behind her. So we see that Jay, who is in the picture in the left, the person who is in front and who is the protagonist, or let's say the hero of the movie, is going to face the villains and to protect the rest of the family group so childbirth can take place. The woman is chanting Om, the sacred syllable in Hinduism, um, and at the same time, in parallel action, we see that Jay is fighting with the villains. Finally, this the birth the woman gives birth to a child after Jay has beaten the villains. When the child is finally born, the film frames it as successful regeneration with a crisis that could have ended in massacre. The hero protects not only the living, but the arrival of new life. The childbirth scene then becomes a climactic statement about continuity. The film does not treat birth as a pause from action. It treats birth as part of the action's meaning. The movie continues with two further climactic sequences tied to the baby. In one, child who is later revealed to be Jay's niece becomes vulnerable. We see the picture below in the center, Jay is with her niece, um, while the group moves through dangerous terrain. In another landmine, in another climatic scene, um, landmines separate the newborn from the group, and Jay must recover the baby while confronting the villain's final threats. Again, the baby is not decorative. The baby becomes the object around which action organizes itself. As we see here, how Jay kills the villain with an arrow. Here, of course, resonates characters like Arjuna, for example. Finally, in the resolution, it is suggested renewed continuity through a prospective marriage and the formation of a new family unit uh, with Jay and a young woman who had helped them not only to escape from for, from these lawless forest, but also to deliver the child. The film closes the arc by returning from threatened extinction to renewed beginnings. So in Tamudu, childbirth appears as epic protection, a sacred continuity, and as a turning point within a violent conflict. Our second movie is Kubera. Kubera is the god of wealth, and the director is Shekhar Kamula. It's also a Telugu film, and it was released in 2025, last year. And it's about beggars, um, beggars, and also very rich villains, right? Again, family appears early as a core motivation. A major plotline involves corruption tied to oil wealth and political collusion. Here we see Eric, the main villain, and how he um, destroys a platform that has found very pure oil. And so he's going to negotiate with this oil with the politician in order to earn more money. A key character is Deepak, who is driven by the desire to reunite with his family after imprisonment when he um, revealed some corruption. Deepak agrees to participate in money laundering for Eric, the villain. The laundering is carried out through beggars who cannot read or write, and who are trained to behave like business figures, and who go to banks to process transactions in their own names. The plan is then to eliminate them. Here we see Deepak, how his wife go to jail to see him, and she shows him a picture of their daughter. Here we see Deva, who is maybe the co-protagonist or protagonist of the movie, who is a beggar. In a flashback, as we see on the right, his mother was run over by a truck that fled the scene. Mother was pregnant and she died. Then, when Deva realizes that he's going to be killed, he escapes from the mansion of Eric, and there he meets Samira, who is going to help him. Another beggar, there are only four beggars, uh, engaged in this money laundering plot. So we see Kushbu is pregnant, this beggar. In the climactic scene, uh, there is a childbirth sequence um, when Kushbu, Samira, and Deva flee to a women's shelter. Deepak also goes there, and he initially compromised morally, but turns against the villains when he witnesses the human cost and the fate reserved for the beggars. So here the film sets up a structure of moral reversal. Deepak first participates for family, for survival, for escape. Then he shifts because the injustice becomes intolerable for him. This shift leads directly into the childbirth climax. Deepak fights to buy time for Khushbu, Deva, and Samira to escape and give birth. Khushbu. Deepak dies in the process, but his sacrifice enables the baby to be born, even though Khushbu dies in childbirth. The narrative then transfers care of the newborn to Samira and Deva, who become a new protective unit. The family is reconfigured. It is not simply biological family. It becomes chosen responsibility, ethical commitment, and continuity built across loss. A later climactic scene places the baby's survival within a violent confrontation between the main villain, Eric, and Deva, the beggar. It ends with the villain's defeat. Finally, the resolution presents the child as a future-bearing figure, and the film closes with the image of a new family configuration formed across poverty and trauma. We see here how Samira and Deva introduce the baby to the mentor of Deva when he was a beggar. So in Kubera, childbirth is not framed primarily as sacred creation. It is framed as ethical struggle, sacrifice, and social justice. Birth becomes a point where moral action is tested and where redemption becomes possible. The third case is Metro Indino, or These Days in Metro, by Anurag Basu, released in 2025, also last year. In this case, it is a Hindi movie. Unlike the previous two films, this is an urban film built around four couple narratives set across major Indian cities. I focus on one couple, Akash and Shruti. Akash uh, wants to be a singer but struggles financially and professionally. Shruti has more stable economic prospects, yet the relationship enters crisis. When Shruti becomes pregnant, Akash, under pressure and frustration, asks her to have an abortion. This storyline also begins with strong family expectations. Relatives and friends function almost like a Greek chorus, openly pressuring the couple toward childbirth. They speak of good news as the arrival of a baby. They frame fertility as urgent. The film externalizes social pressure through this collective voice. The climactic moment arrives through parallel editing, as in the other movies. Akash is offered a chance to audition in an important studio and is asked to sing a song about becoming a father, about the arrival of a first child. At the same time, Shruti, in another city, goes to the clinic for the abortion. The film does not show the procedure directly. Instead, it uses ellipses and emotional cues. The scene becomes climactic not through violence, but through inner conflict, timing, and irreversible choice. Later, the story suggests that the abortion does not take place, although the decision is not shown explicitly. That is, it's an ellipsis of that decision. In the resolution, we see that Shruti has had the child, time has passed, and the birth becomes part of a reconciliation arc. In this case, regeneration is psychological and relational rather than epic. It is not community survival. It is not social justice. It is the restoration or partial restoration of a couple's bond and the reorganization of responsibility. So, in Metrindino, the childbirth event is narratively present but visually displaced, yet it is still climactic because it sits at the peak of decision and transformation and because it reorganizes the future. So let's take a look at some similarities and differences um, in these three movies. First, childbirth is, with respect to similarities, childbirth is positioned near peaks of dramatic intensity. It helps shape turning points and contributes to resolution. Even when the birth itself is not shown, like in Metrendino, the pregnancy decision is placed in a climactic structure. Second, birth functions as a symbol of regeneration. Life continues after crisis, and the child becomes a figure of hope and continuity. Third, these scenes intensify emotion by combining danger, conflict, and renewal. In Tamudo and Kubera, danger is physical and immediate. In Metro Indino, danger is emotional and existential. In all cases, the narrative stakes are high. Fourth, parallel montage plays a key role. Childbirth is intercut with confrontation, sacrifice, or life defining choice. The birth moment is synchronized with another decisive event. This synchronization gives childbirth structural power. It becomes a hinge that joins two narrative lines into one climactic peak. Finally, childbirth is consistently tied to family protection and to the future of a group, whether that group is communal, social, or intimate. The birth is not a decorative subplot. It is bound to what the story says about survival, responsibility, and continuity. The differences matter as well. In Tamudu, childbirth is framed through physical confrontation with epic and sacrificial tones. Sacred chanting links birth to cosmic creation, and the baby stands for the survival of community and the endurance of family. In Kubera, childbirth is connected to social injustice and moral choice. Regeneration is ethical and social. The birth happens because someone sacrifices himself to resist corruption, Deepak, and protect the vulnerable. Continuity is produced through responsibility and solidarity after loss. In Metro Indino, pregnancy and birth function is an urban and intimate register. The regeneration is emotional. It rests on reconciliation, on recognition, and on acceptance of responsibility after conflict. Seen together, these films suggest that in Indian cinema, childbirth can operate as a climactic narrative device. It can sit at the center of decisive action. It can carry symbolic weight far beyond biology. It can restore family continuity, and it can represent renewal after collapse. So, if we compare these um, Indian movies to the Hollywood pattern described by Blight and Knopper, we find a contrast. In those accounts, childbirth in mainstream US cinema is rarely climatic, according to these authors. It is often medicalized, simplified, and displaced through off screen space or ellipses. The visual representation tends to be partial, the core bodily moment is avoided. In some interpretation, explicit childbirth remains a visual taboo. By contrast, the Indian examples we have discussed integrate childbirth into high stakes narrative architecture. Tamudu places it within a violent confrontation and frames it as sacred continuity. Bera places it within sacrifice and ethical and moral transformation. Metro Indino places it within a climactic decision and uses ellipses, but the event still functions structurally as a turning point. So the contrast is not about explicitness, it is also about narrative placement. In these Indian examples, childbirth is allowed to enter the domain of peak intensity, where the story's meaning is decided. In summary, in Indian cinema, childbirth is related to climactic regeneration, while in Hollywood, childbirth is minimized or displaced from the in terms of narrative moment. So let's go now to the conclusions. To conclude, in temporary Indian cinema, childbirth can become a climactic mechanism of narrative closure. It symbolizes restoration and continuity. Its prominence reflects the central place of family and genealogy in Indian storytelling. Childbirth can also be tightly woven into action, sacrifice, and confrontation, which strengthens emotional intensity and raises the stakes. In this way, childbirth appears not only as a biological event, but as a narrative tool that regenerates the family and, by extension, stabilizes social order, whether at the scale of community, at the scale of social ethics and moral, like in Kubera, or at the scale of intimate relationships, as in Metro Indino. So, let's say to finish this presentation, that in many contemporary Indian films, childbirth functions not merely as a biological event, but as a climactic narrative mechanism that restores family continuity and regenerates social order. Thank you very much for your attention.